Shivering beneath a highway overpass, 12-year-old Ethan clutched his loyal German Shepherd, Ranger, the dog's warm body. The only comfort in his harsh reality since his mother's passing left them with nowhere to call home. Rain tapped against the concrete above as he unfolded the rain-splashed letter once more. Official notification that he had won an abandoned mountain farm in a charity lottery. He barely remembered entering with his last dollar. The dilapidated Victorian farmhouse stood silhouetted against the stormy sky as they arrived, its weathered boards and broken windows telling stories of decades of abandonment. In the dim light filtering through grimy windows, something glinted from beneath the peeling wallpaper. What secrets lay forgotten within these walls? Would this unexpected inheritance become his salvation or his greatest danger? And why had fate chosen a homeless boy to inherit this mysterious mountain legacy? The autumn sun cast long shadows across the overgrown path as Ethan approached the weathered Victorian farmhouse, his footsteps hesitant yet determined on the creaking porch boards that protested beneath his weight. Ranger padded silently beside him, the German Shepherd's alert eyes scanning the unfamiliar territory with instinctive caution. Inside, the musty scent of abandonment greeted them, dust particles dancing in the few brave sunbeams that fought through grimy windows, illuminating peeling wallpaper and floors warped by years of neglect. Ethan moved through the first floor with reverent curiosity, his fingers trailing along surfaces thick with dust, leaving visible paths that marked his presence in a house that had known none for decades. The kitchen, with its ancient cast-iron stove, stood frozen in time, cabinets hanging askew revealing empty shelves that once held family meals, while the parlor's faded floral wallpaper curled away from the walls like autumn leaves preparing to fall. It was in what appeared to be a study that Ranger's behavior changed, the dog's ears perking forward as he began pawing insistently at a section of wall where the floral pattern gave way to wooden paneling partially covered by peeling paper. Curious, Ethan peeled back more of the deteriorating wallpaper, revealing what the dog had somehow sensed: a steel door flush against the wall, its surface cold beneath his trembling fingers, a stark industrial anomaly in this otherwise rustic dwelling. No handle adorned its surface, no keyhole offered entry, just smooth, unyielding metal that reflected Ethan's confused expression back at him in its brushed surface. He knocked against it, producing a hollow echo that suggested a significant space beyond, yet no amount of pushing or searching the edges yielded any mechanism to open it. Frustrated but intrigued, Ethan continued exploring adjacent bookshelves, finding them mostly empty save for a few moldering volumes on local history and mining engineering, their pages stiff with humidity and age. It was behind one such book that he discovered the photograph, tucked away as if purposefully hidden, its black and white image remarkably preserved despite the passage of time. A stern-faced man in early 20th century attire stood proudly beside this very house when it was new, its paint fresh and windows gleaming in what appeared to be spring sunshine. Beside him stood a solemn boy of perhaps 10, his eyes possessing a depth unusual for one so young. With a jolt that sent his heart racing, Ethan recognized something eerily familiar in those features, the set of the jaw, the shape of the eyes, a resemblance so striking to his own reflection that it seemed impossible to dismiss as coincidence. He flipped the photograph over with shaking hands, finding faded handwriting that read simply, Jacob and Thomas Caldwell, 1912. Ranger whined softly, pressing against Ethan's leg as if sensing his master's confusion, while outside the window, the mountains loomed dark against the dimming sky, silent witnesses to generations of secrets held within their ancient slopes. Ethan slipped the photograph into his pocket and made another futile attempt at the steel door, pressing his ear against its cold surface as if it might whisper its secrets to him, but hearing only the hollow emptiness of a space untouched for what must have been decades. As daylight faded from the dusty windows, casting the room in lengthening shadows, Ethan felt a strange connection to this place that transcended the simple legal ownership granted by the charity lottery. A pull that seemed to reach across time itself, binding him to the solemn-eyed boy in the photograph and whatever lay hidden behind that mysterious steel door. Darkness enveloped the old farmhouse with an almost predatory intent, seeping through cracks in the walls and pooling in corners as Ethan huddled beneath his thin blanket, the only possession besides Ranger that had accompanied him from his life under the highway overpass. The temperature dropped rapidly with the sun, mountain air turning knife-sharp against his skin, forcing him to pull Ranger closer for warmth as they lay on the dusty wooden floor of what had once been a living room. Sleep proved elusive as the house seemed to come alive around them, its ancient timber frame contracting in the cold with groans and creaks that sent Ranger's head lifting repeatedly, ears pivoting toward sounds that might have been settling wood or something more sinister moving through distant rooms. A persistent scratching behind the walls suggested mice or possibly larger creatures had claimed territories within the structure's hidden spaces, while somewhere upstairs, a loose shutter banged rhythmically against the house whenever the wind gusted. After an hour of shivering in the growing cold, Ethan reluctantly abandoned any hope of sleep and began exploring by the weak beam of his dollar store flashlight, Ranger padding silently behind him, the dog's breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. The kitchen revealed nothing useful beyond rusted utensils and mouse-chewed dishcloths, but a door off the main hallway opened into a small sitting room dominated by a cast-iron wood stove, its black surface reflecting the flashlight beam like the mysterious steel door that had occupied Ethan's thoughts since its discovery. Beside the stove sat a metal bin containing split logs long dried to perfect kindling, preserved in the house's perpetual dryness, alongside crumpled newspapers that had turned yellow with age. With numb fingers, Ethan arranged kindling in the stove, his years of survival on the streets having taught him the precious value of fire, and soon a small flame took hold, casting dancing shadows across the room's faded wallpaper as Ranger settled gratefully before the growing heat. As the fire strengthened, Ethan smoothed out the old newspapers, discovering dates from summer 1978. Their headlines declaring, "Alpine Resources faces opposition from local landowners and Caldwell stands firm against mining corporation's offer." One article featured a photograph of a middle-aged man, identified as Jacob Caldwell, whose stern expression and set jaw bore unmistakable resemblance to both the man in the earlier photograph and, disturbingly, to Ethan himself. The article described Caldwell as the last holdout in the valley against a major mining operation proposed by Alpine Resources, quoting him saying, "What lies beneath this mountain belongs to future generations, not to corporate balance sheets." As Ethan read, the house seemed to respond to the name Caldwell. A sudden violent gust of wind, sending a tremor through the entire structure and causing Ranger to growl low in his throat, eyes fixed on the darkened doorway. A door slammed somewhere deep within the house, followed by what sounded impossibly like footsteps overhead, deliberate and measured, crossing what would be the upstairs hallway. Ranger's hackles rose, a low warning rumble building in his chest as Ethan froze, straining to distinguish between the house's natural noises and what his mind increasingly insisted was an impossible presence moving through rooms that should be empty. The fire popped loudly, sending sparks against the glass, momentarily illuminating what appeared to be a reflection in the window, a face watching from outside, there and gone so quickly that Ethan couldn't be certain he hadn't imagined it. Yet Ranger's fixed stare and continued growling suggested the dog had sensed something too, something that had found them on their first night in a house that was supposed to be abandoned but now felt anything but empty. Dawn broke over the mountains with tentative fingers of light that gradually filled the farmhouse with a golden glow, revealing dust motes dancing in the air and illuminating the exhaustion on Ethan's face after a night of fitful sleep interrupted by the house's mysterious sounds. Ranger's alert bark drew him to the window where he spotted an elderly woman making her deliberate way up the overgrown path, a wicker basket hooked over one arm, and determination evident in her measured steps, despite the obvious arthritis that slowed her progress. Ethan met her at the door, suddenly conscious of his disheveled appearance and the lingering scent of homelessness that weeks under the bridge had embedded in his clothes, while Ranger stood protectively at his side, tail neither wagging nor bristling as he assessed this unexpected visitor. The woman, her face a tapestry of deep lines that mapped a life lived fully in harsh mountain seasons, introduced herself as Martha Holloway from the neighboring farm a mile down the road, her voice carrying the distinctive local cadence that generations in these mountains had shaped. Her weathered hands extended the basket, revealing home-baked bread, a jar of preserves, and a thermos that released steam smelling of rich coffee when she unscrewed the cap, explaining that news traveled quickly in small communities and she'd heard the Caldwell place had finally found a new owner. The shock that transformed her leathery features when Ethan explained his situation. A homeless 12-year-old orphan who'd won the property in a charity lottery he'd entered with his last dollar, caused her hand to tension. Fly to her chest, her pale blue eyes widening beneath silver brows as she muttered something that sounded like, "just like Thomas," before ushering him back inside with a newfound urgency. Martha moved through the house with the familiarity of one who had visited many times before, finding her way directly to the kitchen where she set about preparing a proper breakfast from her supplies, her efficient movements contrasting with her cautious words as she explained that the farm had belonged to the Caldwell family for generations until their sudden disappearance in the late 1972. As they ate at the dusty kitchen table, Martha revealed that Jacob Caldwell had been the last known occupant, a reclusive but respected man who'd become increasingly paranoid in his final months before vanishing without a trace. The same night, his business partner had reportedly died in a mining accident up in the hills behind the property. Her eyes darted occasionally to the walls as if they might be listening, her voice dropping to near whispers when she mentioned Alpine Resources, the mining company that had been trying to acquire the Caldwell land for decades and had nearly succeeded until this unexpected charity lottery had transferred ownership to Ethan. Martha's gaze lingered on Ethan's face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable, studying his features with a puzzled expression before finally commenting that the mountain had a way of calling its own back home, a cryptic statement she refused to elaborate on despite his questions. Before departing, she extracted a promise that he would visit her farm the following day, insisting a boy his age shouldn't be alone in such a place, her concern genuine but tinged with something deeper that Ethan couldn't quite identify. Something that suggested Martha Holloway knew far more about the Caldwell farm and its secrets than she was willing to share with a stranger, even one whose features stirred such obvious recognition in her troubled eyes. The steel door dominated Ethan's thoughts in the days following Martha's visit, drawing him repeatedly to the study where he would press his palm against its cold surface, as if through touch alone he might divine its secrets, while Ranger watched with attentive eyes that reflected the boy's growing obsession. When Martha arrived with additional supplies and found him attempting to pry the edges with a rusted fireplace poker, her reaction was immediate and visceral, her weathered hand gripping his wrist with surprising strength as she warned in a voice barely above a whisper that some doors were meant to remain closed, that Jacob had his reasons for sealing whatever lay beyond. Her uncharacteristic intensity only fueled Ethan's determination, and after her departure, he systematically began searching the house for any tool that might grant access, emptying drawers of tarnished silverware and rusted keys that fit no visible locks, climbing precariously to reach high shelves that yielded nothing but dust and dead insects, and finally moving to the upper floors where empty bedrooms stood in silent memorial to lives long departed. It was in what appeared to have been a child's room, with faded blue paint peeling from the walls and the collapsed remains of a small bed in one corner, that Ranger's behavior changed, his nose working excitedly at a spot near the window where the floorboards met the wall. Ethan knelt beside his dog, running his fingers along the seam of the wooden planks until he felt a slight give, a barely perceptible movement that suggested something different about this particular board. Working his fingers into the narrow gap, he managed to lift the plank, revealing a shallow space beneath that had clearly been hollowed out deliberately, a secret hiding place containing two objects wrapped in oilcloth that had preserved them remarkably well against the passage of time. The first package yielded a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with what appeared at first glance to be gibberish, lines of numbers and letters arranged in patterns that made no immediate sense but clearly represented some form of code or cipher, the handwriting tight and precise, occasionally interrupted by diagrams of what might have been geological formations. The second cloth contained a strange brass key unlike any Ethan had ever seen, its shaft inscribed with symbols similar to those in the journal, its head formed into an intricate design resembling mountain peaks, the metal warm to the touch as if it had absorbed the heat of his hand with unnatural efficiency. That evening, by the light of candles Martha had provided, Ethan tried the brass key in every visible lock in the house, including several times on the steel door despite its lack of any keyhole, the metal seeming to hum faintly when brought near the steel surface but ultimately revealing no obvious function. As he finally settled to sleep with the journal and key hidden beneath his makeshift pillow, the wind outside rose to a mournful howl that seemed to carry whispered voices, while somewhere in the depths of the house, something that might have been footsteps moved with deliberate purpose, a presence that Ranger acknowledged with raised hackles, but made no move to investigate, as if the German Shepherd understood they were not alone in this house, but whatever shared their space was not something that could be confronted through normal means. The 4-mile walk into Pine Ridge tested Ethan's already weary body, the mountain road winding through dense forests that occasionally parted to reveal breathtaking vistas of valleys carved by ancient glaciers. the beauty contrasting sharply with his growing awareness of isolation as he traveled farther from the only shelter he now possessed. Pine Ridge revealed itself as a small cluster of weathered buildings with a distinctly trapped-in-time quality, its main street featuring a general store, post office, diner, and a handful of other establishments that seemed to eye newcomers with institutional suspicion. People paused in their conversations as Ethan passed, their gazes lingering a beat too long on his worn clothes and solitary figure, the absence of parental supervision clearly registering as unusual in a community where everyone knew not just each other, but the histories that had shaped their families for generations. Inside the general store, the initial friendly greeting from the heavy-set proprietor, who introduced himself as Bill Jenkins, underwent a visible transformation when Ethan mentioned needing supplies for the Caldwell place, the man's smile freezing and then collapsing entirely, replaced by a guarded expression that turned his subsequent interactions coldly efficient. Other customers who had been browsing suddenly found reasons to complete their shopping with remarkable haste or to linger conspicuously near Ethan, their whispered comments just audible enough for him to catch fragments about that poor Caldwell boy, and Alpine doesn't forget. When Ethan asked direct questions about the farm's previous owners, Jenkins busied himself rearranging items that needed no attention, offering only that the Caldwells had brought trouble down on themselves and that a boy Ethan's age should consider himself lucky that charity folks didn't know what they were giving away. The store's bell jangled as an elderly man entered, stopping abruptly at the sight of Ethan, his rheumy eyes widening in what appeared to be shocked recognition before he backed out without purchasing anything, leaving Jenkins to mutter something about seeing ghosts. Outside, as Ethan struggled with his purchases, the sudden appearance of a sleek black Mercedes with heavily tinted windows drew his attention, its engine purring with expensive precision as it crawled down the main street at walking pace. The driver invisible behind reflective glass that nevertheless conveyed the distinct impression of intense scrutiny directed solely at him. The car followed his progress for half a block before accelerating smoothly away, its license plate conspicuously mud-covered despite the otherwise immaculate condition of the vehicle, leaving behind a ripple of reaction among the locals who had also noted its presence, their expressions suggesting this was not an unprecedented visitation. At the edge of town, a kindly middle-aged woman leaving the post office took pity on Ethan, offering him a ride back to the farm in her pickup truck, her initial cheerfulness evaporating when he confirmed his destination. Her subsequent silence, broken only by a single cryptic warning delivered as he exited at the overgrown driveway. They never stopped watching that place, boy. And now they'll be watching you too. Whatever you find there, keep it to yourself if you want to stay safe. The journey back to the farmhouse weighed heavy on Ethan, not just from the physical burden of supplies, but from the invisible weight of scrutiny that had followed him through town, leaving him feeling exposed and vulnerable in a way that even homelessness had never quite managed. Ranger greeted him with enthusiastic relief, the dog's presence a comforting anchor in a situation that grew more unsettling with each passing hour. As Ethan unloaded his meager purchases and immediately retreated to what he'd begun thinking of as the study, the mysterious journal calling to him with an urgency he couldn't explain even to himself. The leather-bound volume lay where he'd left it, its pages filled with seemingly nonsensical sequences that nonetheless possessed a deliberate pattern suggesting intelligence rather than madness. And Ethan found himself drawn to the farm's small library with its dust-covered volumes on local history, geology, and engineering. Hour after hour passed as he pored over the cryptic entries, cross-referencing them with diagrams in mining textbooks and engineering manuals, the weak afternoon light gradually surrendering to evening shadows that necessitated lighting the oil lamps Martha had provided, casting the room in a warm, flickering glow that seemed to make the journal's symbols shift and dance across the page. It was a mining engineering text from 1953 that finally provided the breakthrough, its appendix containing a section on surveyor notations and geological shorthand that bore striking similarities to certain repeated elements in the journal's code, allowing Ethan to gradually construct a rudimentary key to the cipher. The first successfully translated sentence sent a chill through him despite the room's growing warmth. I, Jacob Caldwell, record these findings in code, as I no longer know whom to trust and what I have discovered beneath Holloway Ridge must be protected at all costs. The journal entries, once decoded, revealed themselves to be the meticulous observations of a trained mining engineer who had stumbled upon something while surveying his property that had initially confused and then alarmed him. Something referred to only as the deposit that possessed properties unlike any mineral formation documented in modern geology. Subsequent entries detailed Jacob's growing excitement as he researched his discovery, consulting discreetly with university experts, using samples that revealed remarkable conductive properties and molecular structures that defied conventional classification, culminating in his breathless assertion that what lies beneath our family land will change everything: energy production, telecommunications, perhaps even national security. As night deepened outside the windows, Ethan's translation efforts revealed Jacob's growing paranoia, his certainty that he was being watched by representatives from Alpine Resources who had somehow learned of his discovery, his decision to confide only in his business partner Richard Hargrove, and his determination to protect the discovery from exploitation by creating hidden caches of evidence and securing the most sensitive research behind barriers that only blood can open. The journal's handwriting changed as the entries progressed, becoming more hurried and irregular, detailing threatening encounters with corporate representatives offering increasingly large sums for the property, culminating in a final, chilling entry dated just days before Jacob's disappearance. They will not take what isn't theirs to take. I have sealed the laboratory and hidden the core samples where they will never find them. Richard agrees that what we've found belongs to the future, not to men who see only dollar signs. If anything happens to me, the truth remains protected by bonds stronger than steel, the bonds of blood and legacy that will someday bring the rightful heir to unlock what I have hidden. Ranger's sudden growling pulled Ethan's attention from dollars. The journal, the dog's gaze fixed on the window where, for a brief moment, the boy thought he saw the distinctive shape of a human face peering in from the darkness. There and gone so quickly, he couldn't be certain it wasn't a trick of the lamplight reflecting against the glass. Yet the German shepherd's continued alertness suggested something or someone had indeed been watching from the shadows, bearing witness to discoveries that had remained hidden for decades, until this unlikely inheritor had begun unraveling threads of a mystery that had already cost at least one man his life. The deep stillness of mountain midnight shattered with Ranger's low, rumbling growl, the sound vibrating through Ethan's consciousness and dragging him instantly from sleep to high alert, his body tensing beneath the thin blanket as his mind registered the dog's rigid posture, ears forward and hackles raised toward the kitchen door. A soft scratching at the lock confirmed the German shepherd's warning was no false alarm. The methodical movement of metal against metal, suggesting someone with tools rather than keys, was attempting to gain entry to the farmhouse. Ethan grabbed the journal and brass key from beneath his makeshift pillow, clutching them to his chest as he motioned Ranger to follow him silently up the creaking staircase, each careful footstep seeming thunderous in the midnight quiet, his heart hammering so loudly he feared it might betray their location to whoever worked at breaching the home's minimal security. They reached the second floor just as the distinct click of the kitchen door lock giving way echoed through the house, followed by the whisper of well-oiled hinges and the soft fall of deliberate footsteps on worn linoleum. Ethan pulled Ranger into a narrow linen closet at the end of the upstairs hallway, leaving the door open just enough for a sliver of visibility, his hand resting on the dog's neck in a silent command to remain quiet that the intelligent animal obeyed despite the continued tension in his powerful muscles. The beam of a high-powered flashlight preceded the intruder up the staircase, cutting through darkness with clinical precision, revealing glimpses of a tall figure moving with the confident stealth of someone accustomed to unauthorized entry. The occasional metallic glint, suggesting the possible presence of a weapon tucked inside an expensively tailored suit jacket that seemed absurdly formal for a midnight breaking and entering. The man methodically searched each upstairs room, pulling open drawers and checking beneath beds with practiced efficiency, his movements suggesting not random vandalism but a targeted search for something specific, his silence broken only once by a muttered curse when a floorboard creaked unexpectedly beneath his weight. After completing his inspection of the upper floor, the intruder descended to the main level, his flashlight beam swinging with increasing urgency as he entered the study where the hidden steel door remained concealed behind its deteriorating wallpaper. Ethan's breath caught as the man immediately gravitated toward that very wall, his gloved fingers tracing the exact pattern Ranger had identified days earlier, peeling back layers of paper until the metallic surface gleamed in the flashlight beam, confirming the intruder's apparent foreknowledge of the house's secrets. For nearly 20 minutes, the man examined the seamless door, checking its edges with what appeared to be specialized tools, occasionally consulting a small electronic device that emitted soft beeps of varying pitch depending on where he held it against the steel surface. Frustration gradually overtook the intruder's methodical approach, his movements becoming more aggressive as the door refused to yield its secrets, until finally he slammed his palm against the unyielding metal in a gesture of defeat before conducting one final sweep of the room, his flashlight beam lingering on the exact spot where Ethan had been sitting earlier while decoding the journal, though thankfully the boy had left no obvious evidence of his discoveries. The man's departure was as silent as his entry, the careful reclosing of the kitchen door suggesting a desire to leave no trace of his intrusion, though he couldn't disguise his footprints in the dust that chronicled his thorough examination of the house. Only when the sound of an engine starting and then fading into the distance confirmed the intruder's departure did Ethan release his death grip on Ranger's fur, his young body trembling with delayed fear and the chilling realization that the warnings from Martha and the townspeople had been far from paranoid fantasy. Someone was actively searching for whatever Jacob Caldwell had hidden, and now they knew exactly where Ethan was sleeping. Sleep eluded Ethan for what remained of the night, his mind replaying the midnight invasion in vivid detail, while his body remained coiled with tension beside Ranger's protective warmth, both boy and dog starting at every creak and groan the old house produced in its nocturnal symphony. Dawn brought little comfort as Ethan realized the vulnerable nature of his situation, an orphaned child alone in a house being watched by unknown individuals with resources and determination enough to orchestrate breaking and entering with professional precision. With the morning light lending false courage, Ethan embarked on a systematic search for a secure hiding place within the house, somewhere to conceal both himself and the journal during future intrusions. His exploration eventually leading to a narrow door at the end of the upstairs hallway that opened to reveal a steep, ladder-like staircase ascending into shadows. The attic greeted him with the musty embrace of decades-old dust and the distinctive aroma of sun-heated wood, the space illuminated by weak light filtering through small, grimy windows set into the gabled ends of the roof. Unlike the relatively empty rooms below, the attic had served as the repository for generations of Caldwell possessions. Cardboard boxes and wooden crates stacked in precarious towers that formed a maze through the expansive space, each container a potential time capsule of the family's history. Ranger moved cautiously between the narrow passages created by the boxes, his nose working constantly as Ethan began a methodical examination of the attic's contents, discovering children's toys from the early 1900s, clothing packed away in mothballs, and holiday decorations that hadn't seen December light in half a century. It was in the far corner beneath the lowest part of the sloped roof that Ethan discovered what appeared to be Jacob Caldwell's professional materials. Carefully organized boxes containing surveying equipment, rock hammers, core sample containers, and technical books on geology and mining engineering, many with handwritten notes in the margins that matched the handwriting in the coded journal. A wooden crate labeled Holloway Ridge Survey, 1977, contained dozens of carefully rolled maps secured with faded ribbon, each detailing different aspects of the mountain's geological composition, with certain areas marked in red pencil and annotated with the same code Ethan had begun to decipher. Tucked beneath these maps sat a small metal lockbox, its once gleaming surface now dulled with age but its lock still robust, frustrating Ethan's initial attempts to access its contents until he remembered the strange brass key discovered beneath the floorboard, which slid into the mechanism with perfect precision and turned with a satisfying click that suggested it had been waiting decades for this exact moment. Inside, wrapped in protective waxed paper, lay dozens of newspaper clippings meticulously preserved, their headlines chronicling an escalating dispute between the Caldwell family and Alpine Resources Corporation spanning the mid-1970s, beginning with seemingly generous offers to purchase the property and gradually revealing the corporation's increasingly aggressive tactics when faced with Jacob's steadfast refusal to sell. Articles detailed court battles over mineral rights, allegations of water contamination at neighboring properties that had sold to the company, and heated town meetings where Jacob stood virtually alone against corporate lawyers promising economic revival for the struggling mountain community. The most recent clipping, dated just 1 week before Jacob's disappearance, featured a photograph of a corporate board meeting where Alpine's CEO announced inevitable acquisition of all key properties in the Holloway Ridge development zone, his confident smile contrasting with a smaller photograph of Jacob Caldwell standing defiantly before his farmhouse, the caption quoting him saying, "Some things are not for sale at any price, and what lies beneath this mountain is one of them." The morning fog clung to the valley like a protective shroud as Ethan made his way down the overgrown path toward Martha's farm, the journal and newspaper clippings carefully wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into his threadbare backpack, Ranger trotting alertly beside him, the dog's senses clearly attuned to potential watchers among the mist-draped trees. Martha greeted them at her kitchen door with momentary warmth that faltered when she noted the serious expression on Ethan's face and the worn backpack clutched protectively to his chest, her weathered hands pausing in their bread kneading as she silently gestured him toward the faded gingham-covered table in the corner of her sun-drenched kitchen. The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly as Ethan carefully arranged his discoveries across the worn wooden surface, the coded journal pages and yellowed newspaper clippings forming a mosaic of secrets long buried that seemed to draw the oxygen from Martha's lungs as she slowly lowered herself into a chair, flour-covered fingers hovering tremulously over the materials without quite touching them, as if they might burn her skin. When her eyes finally lifted to meet Ethan's, they swam with unshed tears that transformed her from sturdy mountain woman to vulnerable witness, her voice dropping to a whisper as she confessed what the boy had already begun to suspect, that she had known Jacob Caldwell far better than a mere neighbor might, having been engaged to marry him in the summer of 1977, mere months before his unexplained disappearance. Martha's fingers found a simple chain around her neck, drawing forth a ring that had been hidden beneath her clothing, a modest diamond that caught the morning sunlight as she explained how Jacob had changed in those final months, his initial excitement over a discovery in the mountain gradually giving way to paranoia and fear as representatives from Alpine Resources began appearing with offers that quickly transformed into thinly veiled threats. The mining corporation had been relentless in their pursuit of the Caldwell property, Martha revealed, continuing their campaign long after Jacob vanished, purchasing surrounding properties one by one until her family's farm and the seemingly abandoned Caldwell place were the last remaining private holdings in the valley, their persistence suggesting whatever Jacob had discovered beneath Holloway Ridge held value beyond ordinary mineral deposits. Martha's voice grew distant as she recounted the night Jacob had last visited her, his face haggard with sleeplessness yet animated by fierce determination as he promised to protect his discovery from those who would exploit it, explaining that he had devised a way to secure his research and findings so that only someone worthy could access them, someone with the patience and integrity to use the discovery for the greater good rather than corporate profit. Tears finally spilled down Martha's lined cheeks as she admitted that despite decades of speculation and private investigation, she had never learned exactly what Jacob had found in the mountain or what had happened to him after he left her home that night, though the mysterious death of his business partner in a supposed mining accident the very same evening had always struck her as far too convenient to be coincidental. Her gnarled fingers gently closed the journal as she looked directly into Ethan's eyes with sudden intensity, noting aloud the uncanny resemblance he bore to the Caldwell lineage before voicing the belief she had harbored silently for over 40 years, that Jacob had discovered something of such immense value that powerful men had been willing to kill for it, and that his final act had been to ensure that whatever lay beneath Holloway Ridge would remain protected until someone with Caldwell blood might someday claim their inheritance. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Pine Ridge Cemetery as Martha's ancient pickup truck rattled to a stop outside the wrought iron gates, the sacred ground positioned on a gentle slope that offered sweeping views of the valley below, while mountains loomed protectively on all sides like ancient guardians of the dead. Martha moved with surprising purpose through the weathered headstones, her cane occasionally stabbing the soft earth for support as she led Ethan along paths she clearly knew by heart, Ranger following at a respectful distance as if the dog somehow understood the solemnity of this place where generations lay beneath the watching sky. The Caldwell family plot occupied a prominent position near the cemetery's center, marked by a granite monument that bore the family name in letters deep enough to have resisted decades of harsh mountain weather, surrounded by individual markers that chronicled a lineage stretching back to the 1850s, when the first Caldwell had staked his claim in these remote mountains. Martha moved methodically from stone to stone, her weathered finger tracing names and dates as she shared brief stories that breathed momentary life into long-dead strangers. Thomas Caldwell, who'd built the original homestead, Eliza, who'd maintained the farm through the Civil War while raising 7 children alone, generations of miners and farmers who'd worked the land, and eventually Jacob's parents who died within months of each other in the early 1970s, leaving him the sole inheritor of the Caldwell legacy. It was what was missing that drew Ethan's attention most sharply. the conspicuous absence of any marker for Jacob himself, despite the passing of over 40 years since his disappearance. A fact Martha acknowledged with a pained expression as she explained that without a body, Jacob had never been officially declared dead, existing instead in the terrible limbo of the missing where grief finds no concrete anchor. As Martha knelt to place wildflowers on the grave of Jacob's mother, Ethan's attention was drawn to movement across the cemetery where a sleek black luxury car had parked and a man in an expensive suit emerged, moving with confident purpose through the headstones toward a simple marble marker positioned somewhat apart from family groupings. Even from a distance, the visitor's bearing suggested wealth and influence, his perfectly tailored suit and leather briefcase marking him as distinctly out of place in the humble rural cemetery, his movements efficient and businesslike even in this setting that demanded reverence. The man placed a small bouquet of precisely arranged flowers at the base of the headstone, stood with head bowed for exactly 30 seconds by Ethan's count, then turned and walked back to his vehicle without the lingering pace of someone genuinely grieving, more like someone completing an assigned task with mechanical obligation. Once the black car had departed in a cloud of dust, Ethan made his way to the grave, Martha following with curious reluctance, where they discovered the simple inscription, Richard Hargrove, 1935 to 1978, devoted husband and faithful partner, the date of death precisely aligned with the week of Jacob's disappearance. Martha's sharp intake of breath confirmed the significance as she gripped Ethan's shoulder with surprising strength, whispering that Richard had been Jacob's business partner and closest friend, the only person beside herself whom Jacob had trusted with knowledge of his discovery. His supposed mining accident, having been ruled accidental despite suspicious circumstances that had haunted Martha's memories for decades. The cemetery visit haunted Ethan's thoughts as he returned to his painstaking translation of Jacob's journal that evening. The coded pages spread across the kitchen table, illuminated by flickering lamplight that cast dancing shadows on the walls, as if unseen presences observed his progress. Hours melted into one another as he cross-referenced symbols with his growing cipher key. Ranger's warm body pressed against his feet, providing the only comfort in the increasingly oppressive silence of the old farmhouse, broken occasionally by distant sounds that might have been settling timber or something more deliberate, moving beyond the pool of lamplight. New entries emerged from the cryptic text like ghosts materializing from fog, revealing Jacob Caldwell's growing excitement as his initial geological survey had accidentally uncovered what appeared to be an entirely unknown mineral compound deep within Holloway Ridge, something with crystalline properties that defied classification within existing mineralogical frameworks. Detailed diagrams showed molecular structures alongside Jacob's notes documenting extraordinary properties of conductivity, luminescence, and energy storage capacities that exceeded anything in scientific literature, the engineer's precise handwriting occasionally giving way to almost childlike excitement as he described potential applications that could revolutionize telecommunications, transform energy production, and create computing capabilities beyond our current imagination. Midway through the journal, the tone shifted dramatically as Jacob recounted a meeting with university scientists who had tested his samples, describing their stunned disbelief followed by urgent questions about the deposit's location and exclusivity rights. One government-connected researcher having allegedly remarked that such a material would be classified as a strategic resource with national security implications if its properties could be verified at scale. Subsequent entries chronicled Jacob's growing certainty that he was being followed, suspicious vehicles appearing on rural roads, strange clicks on the telephone line, and unfamiliar faces in town asking questions about the Caldwell property, culminating in a confrontation with representatives from Alpine Resources who had somehow learned of his discovery, despite his careful secrecy. The journal's handwriting deteriorated as paranoia took hold, Jacob's once precise notation becoming jagged and hurried as he documented moving his research equipment to the secure location and creating elaborate mechanisms to protect his discovery from those who would weaponize what should benefit all humanity. The final dated entries sent chills through Ethan's body, describing Jacob's certainty that they will not stop until they possess what lies beneath our mountain, and his desperate efforts to hide everything that matters, the research, the samples, and the map to the main deposit in a location where only blood can find it. Only a true Caldwell will recognize the path. The journal's last entry, dated the very night of Jacob's disappearance, contained a cryptic message that seemed written in haste, the pen having torn the paper in places. Richard believes we've been betrayed by someone at the university. We're moving the final samples tonight. If anything happens to me, remember that blood calls to blood across generations. What flows in my veins will someday guide another to complete what I've begun. The key is in the blood. The door will open only to its rightful heir, and the mountain will protect its treasures until that day comes. Ethan's fingers trembled as he reached the journal's final page, finding not coded text but a detailed drawing of what appeared to be a DNA double helix intertwined with mountain peaks, below which a single line of uncoded text read, "The ultimate lock requires the ultimate key, that which cannot be stolen, duplicated, or forged." The sharp knock at the farmhouse door came like a thunderclap the following afternoon, causing Ranger to leap to his feet with hackles raised while Ethan hastily gathered the journal pages and hid them beneath a loose floorboard he'd discovered in the kitchen pantry. Standing on the weathered porch was a woman who seemed utterly out of place in the rural mountain setting. Her tailored charcoal suit, immaculate blonde bob, and leather portfolio suggesting metropolitan corporate power rather than country hospitality. Her practiced smile never quite reaching eyes that assessed Ethan with calculating precision as she introduced herself as Victoria West, Senior Acquisition Director for Alpine Resources Corporation. With practiced ease, she maneuvered past Ethan's hesitant greeting and into the house before he could object, her designer heels clicking authoritatively across the worn floorboards as she surveyed the dilapidated interior with poorly disguised distaste, before selecting the least dusty chair at the kitchen table and arranging herself with practiced poise. From her leather portfolio emerged a stack of meticulously organized documents which she spread before Ethan with the confident flourish of someone accustomed to controlling negotiations, explaining in a voice both melodic and measured that Alpine Resources had been maintaining tax payments on the property for decades as a professional courtesy following Jacob Caldwell's disappearance, a gesture that had established certain legal considerations that the charity lottery administrators had unfortunately overlooked when transferring ownership. Victoria's manicured finger tapped a figure on one document that made Ethan's eyes widen. $600,000 offered as fair market value plus inconvenience compensation for the immediate transfer of the property to Alpine Resources. A sum presented with the casual confidence of someone offering a child candy, accompanied by sympathetic observations about how a boy in Ethan's circumstances could certainly benefit from financial security rather than the burden of a decaying property. When Ethan didn't immediately reach for the fountain pen she extended, Victoria's expression underwent a subtle transformation, warmth draining from her features like water through a sieve as she produced additional documents detailing the extensive repairs needed to bring the house up to code, the potential liability issues, and the challenging legal questions surrounding a minor's ability to maintain legitimate ownership without guardian supervision. Leaning forward with newfound intensity, her voice dropped to a register that carried unmistakable warning as she mentioned how tragic it would be if county services were forced to intervene regarding an orphan child living in unsafe conditions, how the state foster system was notoriously challenging for boys his age, and how unfortunate it would be if his loyal dog couldn't accompany him into the system. Ranger sensed the shifting atmosphere, moving to press against Ethan's leg with a low rumble building in his throat, causing Victoria's gaze to flick toward the German Shepherd with momentary unease, before she regained her composure and produced a final document, explaining in clipped tones that Alpine had legal grounds to challenge the lottery transfer based on their years of tax payments, but would prefer an amicable resolution rather than a protracted court battle that would inevitably drain any resources a homeless orphan might possess. As Victoria finally fell silent, the ticking of the ancient kitchen clock suddenly seemed thunderous in the charged atmosphere, her cold eyes never leaving Ethan's face, as she placed her business card atop the unsigned contract with deliberate precision, informing him he had exactly 48 hours to make the sensible decision before Alpine Resources would be forced to pursue less generous avenues of acquisition. Victoria West's threatening ultimatum hung over Ethan like storm clouds as he hurried through town toward the county library the following morning, Martha having arranged for her granddaughter Lily to meet him there during her shift, the young woman's position as assistant librarian granting access to historical archives not available to the general public. Lily proved to be a quiet, serious woman in her late 20s with her grandmother's observant eyes and a master's degree in local history that had found limited professional application in the economically struggling region, her natural reticence warming considerably when Ethan explained his situation and the corporate pressure he now faced. The basement archive smelled of dust and aging paper, rows of metal shelving containing leather-bound volumes of county records, newspaper collections preserved on microfiche, and cardboard boxes filled with photographs and documents donated by prominent local families over generations, a treasure trove of regional memory largely untouched by the digital revolution. Lily moved through this paper labyrinth with practiced efficiency, gathering materials related to both the Caldwell property and Alpine Resources, while explaining in hushed tones that her grandmother had shared stories of Jacob throughout her childhood, Martha's unresolved grief having transformed the missing man into something of a family legend. The county death records confirmed Richard Hargrove had died on the 17th of October 1978. The official cause listed as accidental death due to mineshaft collapse, despite the curious notation that his body had been found not in a traditional mining operation but on privately owned land with no registered mining permit. The coroner's more detailed report, noting multiple traumatic injuries, consistent with falling, but also documenting unusual bruising patterns that suggested to Lily's trained eye the possibility of a physical altercation prior to death. Business incorporation documents revealed Hargrove and Jacob had formed a small geological consulting company in early 1978, specializing in mineral surveying and property assessment, with financial records showing a significant influx of capital in August that same year from an unnamed private investor who had demanded no formal partnership documentation. The most illuminating discoveries came from the library's collection of regional business publications, where a 1,978-feature article on Alpine Resources showcased its leadership team, including then-CEO Gerald West, standing confidently beside scale models of planned mining operations throughout the region, the executive's distinctive pale blue eyes and sharp features unmistakably mirrored in his daughter Victoria 4 decades later. A photograph from the company's annual stockholder meeting that same year captured Gerald West in conversation with a younger man Lily identified as Richard Hargrove, based on cemetery records, their body language suggesting familiarity beyond casual acquaintance despite no public acknowledgement of their connection, while a separate image from a community business function showed Jacob Caldwell deliberately turning away from the camera as West approached him, his expression capturing a moment of undisguised suspicion. Most damning of all was a small legal notice published 2 days after Hargrove's death and Jacob's disappearance, announcing Alpine Resources' application for emergency mineral rights assessment on the Caldwell property based on abandoned status, a move blocked only by Martha's family's immediate legal intervention, proving Jacob had never been declared legally dead and therefore his property remained protected from corporate acquisition, the beginning of a 4-decade standoff that had apparently ended only when the charity lottery had unexpectedly transferred ownership to Ethan. The library discoveries weighed heavily on Ethan as he returned to the farmhouse, the historical photographs having confirmed his suspicions about Alpine Resources' decades-long pursuit of the property, and the troubling connection between Victoria West's father and the mysterious death of Jacob's business partner. Ranger greeted him with unusual agitation, the German shepherd pacing and whining with increasing urgency until Ethan finally followed him down the narrow stairs to the cellar, a space he had previously explored only cursorily due to its dank darkness and the unsettling scurrying sounds that suggested generations of rodents had claimed it as their domain. The dog moved with single-minded determination across the packed earth floor, bypassing rusted gardening tools and abandoned preserving jars to focus on what appeared to be solid stone foundation wall, where he began digging with such frantic intensity that dirt flew in all directions, his powerful paws excavating with precision that suggested purpose rather than canine caprice. Ethan joined the effort with a rusted garden trowel, curiosity overcoming his exhaustion as they gradually revealed what appeared to be a small wooden door set flush against the foundation, its existence having been deliberately concealed beneath packed earth and carefully arranged storage items that would deter casual investigation. The door's iron hinges protested with decades of accumulated rust as Ethan finally worked it open, revealing a narrow tunnel roughly hewn through solid rock, just wide enough for a man to navigate in a crouch, disappearing into darkness that his flashlight beam could not fully penetrate. Hesitation warred briefly with determination before Ethan took a deep breath and entered the passage, Ranger pressing close behind him as they moved deeper into the mountain, the temperature dropping noticeably with each yard of progress, while the air took on mineral qualities that spoke of vast underground spaces untouched by human breath for generations. The passage occasionally widened into small chambers where support beams prevented collapse, evidence of skilled mining technique rather than amateur excavation, before ultimately emerging into a cave large enough that Ethan's flashlight couldn't illuminate its full dimensions, the beam catching glimpses of stalactites hanging like stone daggers from the distant ceiling. This natural cathedral had clearly served as Jacob's secret laboratory, evident from the abandoned equipment arranged on makeshift workbenches, microscopes draped in protective cloth that had preserved their functionality, geological testing apparatus, core sample containers labeled with the same coding system from the journal, and filing cabinets whose contents had been removed, leaving only empty drawers hanging open like silent screams. At the center of the cave, positioned atop a natural stone formation that resembled an altar, sat a rectangular metal container approximately the size of a small suitcase, its surface gleaming with a silvery blue finish that appeared untarnished by time. The name Caldwell meticulously carved into its lid alongside a pattern that matched the DNA mountain helix design from the journal's final page. The container had no visible hinges, locks, or seams to suggest how it might open, its edges seamlessly joined as if forged from a single piece of metal, while embedded in its center was a small, circular depression lined with what appeared to be tiny needle points arranged in a spiral pattern, their purpose unclear until Ethan recalled Jacob's final journal entry about blood being the key. Understanding washing over him in a cold wave as he realized what the strange mechanism required. Genetic confirmation from a true Caldwell descendant. A lock designed to open only to someone sharing Jacob's bloodline. A security system both primitive and brilliant in its simplicity that had protected its contents for over 40 years, while corporations and treasure hunters had searched in vain for what now lay directly before a 12-year-old orphan who had won an abandoned farm in a charity lottery that suddenly seemed far less random than Providence. Moonlight filtered through a narrow fissure in the cave ceiling, casting ethereal blue light across the metal container as Ethan examined the strange depression with its spiral of tiny needles, his fingers hovering above the mechanism while his mind processed the implications of Jacob's cryptic journal references to "only blood can find it, and the key is in the blood." The spiral pattern suddenly resolved in his understanding as a primitive DNA testing device, brilliant in its simplicity, yet nearly impossible to circumvent. A lock that would open only to someone sharing genetic markers with its creator. A security system that had successfully protected its contents through decades, while corporate interests had searched in vain for Jacob's discoveries. For several moments, Ethan hesitated, the rational part of his young mind questioning why his blood would possibly trigger a mechanism designed for Caldwell descendants, yet the undeniable resemblance he bore to the boy in the 1912 photograph, and Martha's cryptic comments about Mountain calling its own back home, compelled his trembling finger toward the spiral center where a particularly prominent needle awaited. The sharp sting as the needle punctured his skin sent a jolt through Ethan's arm, followed immediately by the whirring of long-dormant machinery awakening within the container, mechanisms clicking and turning as if recognizing a long-awaited signal, his blood disappearing into microscopic channels that presumably carried it to whatever analytical device Jacob had engineered decades before modern DNA testing had become commonplace. For 30 breathless seconds, nothing happened, and then, with a soft, pneumatic hiss, the seemingly seamless container split perfectly down its center, the two halves opening like a book to reveal contents preserved in an environment evidently designed to resist time's decay. Nestled in precisely machined compartments lay geological surveys far more detailed than those in the attic, showing extensive mineral deposits beneath Holloway Ridge, with sample analysis reports documenting properties that, even to Ethan's untrained eye, appeared extraordinary. Beside these lay legal documents including mining rights protections, patents pending on the mineral's applications, and most surprisingly, a last will and testament naming Jacob's rightful blood descendants as sole inheritors with explicit prohibitions against corporate development of the deposits without strict environmental protections. At the center lay a small recording device resembling a dictaphone, remarkably preserved alongside several labeled tapes, the first marked simply "The Truth, October 15, 1978, which Ethan's trembling fingers managed to load into the machine, its mechanisms functioning perfectly as if time had not touched it within the container's protective environment. Jacob Caldwell's voice emerged from decades of silence, deep and resolute despite underlying tension, confirming Ethan's worst suspicions as he detailed discovering a mineral compound with unprecedented technological applications. His growing paranoia validated when he learned his business partner Richard Hargrove had secretly contacted Alpine Resources, the company's CEO Gerald West having offered Hargrove significant compensation for information leading to acquisition of the Caldwell property. The recording chronicled Jacob's final days of freedom, as he worked frantically to secure his discovery against corporate theft. His voice occasionally breaking with emotion as he described preparing this container as a time capsule for the future. Caldwell, who would someday claim their rightful inheritance. The recording ending with words that sent chills through Ethan's body. If you're hearing this, then blood has found blood across time. And you must now decide whether what lies beneath our mountain will serve humanity's highest potential or be exploited for profit by those who value wealth above all else. Choose wisely, for you now carry the burden I could no longer bear alone. The recorded confession continued as Ethan and Ranger sat motionless in the cavern laboratory. Jacob Caldwell's voice, emerging from decades of silence with revelations that painted a devastating picture of corporate greed and personal betrayal that had ultimately cost at least one man his life. Jacob explained in methodical detail how his routine geological survey of the family property had accidentally uncovered what laboratory analysis confirmed to be an unprecedented deposit of rare earth elements essential for advanced technology, but with properties far exceeding anything documented in scientific literature. Elements that could revolutionize energy storage, computer processing, and telecommunications if developed responsibly with proper research oversight. What had begun as exciting scientific discovery had transformed into nightmare when Jacob realized the potential military applications of these minerals in the Cold War era. His initial university consultations having triggered interest from government contractors and corporate entities who viewed the discovery through the lens of weapons development and profit potential rather than humanitarian advancement. The recording detailed Jacob's growing paranoia as unmarked vehicles began appearing near the property and phone calls were mysteriously disconnected, culminating in his devastating discovery that Richard Hargrove, his business partner and trusted friend since college, had secretly contacted Alpine Resources with information about the discovery. Enticed by CEO Gerald West's offer of significant financial compensation and a permanent executive position within the company once acquisition of the Caldwell property was complete, Jacob's voice grew strained as he described confronting Hargrove at the cave entrance on that final October night, the heated argument that had escalated into physical struggle near the dangerous ridge path, and the horrifying moment when Hargrove had lost his footing and plummeted down the rocky slope, his body lying broken on the stones below, while Jacob stood in shocked silence, the accidental death instantly transforming him from respected community member to potential murder suspect once Hargrove's corporate connections became known. With measured words that suggested careful consideration, Jacob explained his impossible choice, remaining to face murder accusations orchestrated by a powerful corporation that would use his prosecution to gain control of the mineral rights, or disappearing to protect both himself and the discovery he believed should benefit humanity rather than corporate shareholders or military interests. The recording detailed Jacob's meticulous planning as he gathered evidence of Alpine's corporate espionage, environmental violations, and potential involvement in other suspicious deaths related to land acquisition. Documentation he had sealed within this container alongside geological proof of the deposit's value, creating a time capsule of truth protected by genetic verification that would someday exonerate him while empowering his descendants to make responsible decisions about the resource's future development. As the recording concluded, Jacob's voice softened with unexpected emotion as he addressed his unknown listener directly, expressing hope that whoever shared his bloodline strongly enough to open this container would possess the wisdom and integrity to resist the temptations of wealth that would inevitably accompany this inheritance, entrusting to them the moral responsibility of ensuring these resources served humanity's highest needs rather than corporate greed or military dominance. The tape clicked to silence, leaving Ethan stunned in the cave's cool darkness, the weight of inherited responsibility settling on his young shoulders as he realized with absolute certainty that Martha's cryptic comments and his uncanny resemblance to the Caldwell photographs were no coincidence. The blood that had opened this container bound him through generations to the man whose voice had just entrusted him with both scientific discovery and moral obligation that powerful interests would still kill to control. Dawn had barely broken over the mountains when Ethan's cautious exit from the cave entrance was met with the unmistakable sound of twigs snapping beneath deliberate footsteps, his heart freezing as Victoria West's voice cut through the morning mist with cold precision. instructing unseen men to secure the boy and whatever he's carrying, while emphasizing that Alpine Resources would handle any unfortunate accidents that might occur during his apprehension. Clutching the recorded confession and most damning documents to his chest, Ethan bolted into the dense underbrush with Ranger at his heels, the German shepherd instinctively positioning himself between his young master and the pursuing men whose shouts echoed through the trees as Victoria's commanding voice ordered them to find him at any cost, with chilling emphasis on securing the evidence rather than ensuring the boy's safety. The forest that had seemed merely atmospheric the day before transformed into a labyrinthine sanctuary, as Ethan's small frame allowed him to slip through narrow gaps between boulders and navigate fallen logs that slowed his adult pursuers. Years of street survival having honed instincts that now guided his desperate flight away from the established trails where Victoria's men concentrated their search. The crackle of radio communication confirmed his worst fears as he overheard fragments of conversation revealing Victoria had stationed additional men along the main road and near the farmhouse, effectively cutting off obvious escape routes, while a helicopter's distant thrum suggested aerial reinforcement approaching to scan the forest canopy for movement below. It was Ranger who sensed the tactical advantage of the mountain stream, nudging Ethan toward the rushing water where their scent would be lost and footprints washed away. Man and dog wading through frigid current for nearly half a mile before finding a rocky outcropping that allowed exit without leaving traceable evidence, the dog's wilderness instincts proving far superior to corporate security training. The mountain itself seemed to offer protection as sudden fog rolled down from higher elevations, reducing visibility and disorienting the search parties, whose frustrated shouts occasionally reached Ethan's ears as he navigated by intuition rather than sight, using moss growth on tree trunks to maintain a consistent direction, while the helicopter's futile circling above the impenetrable cloud cover represented a small victory against overwhelming resources. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Ranger's ears suddenly perked toward a familiar sound imperceptible to human hearing, the dog leading Ethan on a seemingly random path that eventually revealed its logic as they emerged from the forest's edge directly behind Martha's farmhouse. Having approached from the mountainside rather than the road where Victoria's men maintained vigilant watch, Martha's shocked expression quickly transformed to determined efficiency as she ushered boy and dog through her kitchen door and immediately closed all curtains, her weathered hands steady as she made a single phone call with cryptic instructions to bring the papers now, before securing her shotgun from above the fireplace and positioning herself at the window with the calm resolve of a Fento mountain woman prepared to defend her home against corporate intruders. The evidence spread across Martha's kitchen table told an undeniable story of corporate conspiracy, environmental crimes, and decades of persecution, but it was Jacob's recorded voice that brought tears to Martha's eyes as she heard her long-lost fiancé speak across time, his final testimony providing irrefutable proof that would finally expose Alpine Resources' criminal history, while answering questions that had haunted her for over 40 years. Martha's ancient rotary phone spun with decisive purpose as she dialed a number from memory, her voice taking on an authority Ethan hadn't previously heard when she simply stated, "Michael, it's your Aunt Martha, and I need you at the farm right now. It's about Jacob," before hanging up without waiting for response, explaining to Ethan that her nephew Michael Holloway had been elected county sheriff 3 terms running, his childhood fascination with his aunt's missing fiancé having inspired a law enforcement career focused on justice rather than convenience. Within 20 minutes, a sheriff's department SUV rolled up the gravel driveway, Martha's tall, broad-shouldered nephew entering with the cautious assessment of a man accustomed to walking into uncertain situations, his weathered face beneath the standard-issue Stetson revealing both family resemblance to Martha and the skeptical expression of someone who had heard too many implausible stories throughout his career. Sheriff Holloway's initial reaction to Ethan's presence was professional concern about an unaccompanied minor living in an abandoned property, his attention shifting quickly to surprised recognition when Martha explained the charity lottery circumstance and pointed out the boy's striking resemblance to Caldwell family photographs displayed on her mantelpiece. Professional skepticism dominated as Ethan hesitantly shared his discoveries, the sheriff's expression remaining impassive during explanations of hidden journals and secret underground laboratories that clearly strained credibility. Though his demeanor shifted perceptibly when Jacob's recorded voice filled the kitchen, the electronic verification of date and voice pattern analysis built into the recording device, establishing authentication that couldn't easily be dismissed as childish imagination or elaborate hoax. The sheriff's practiced neutrality cracked visibly when the recording mentioned Alpine Resources' environmental violations in neighboring counties, cases that had mysteriously disappeared from court dockets over decades, despite his own department's evidence collection. His jaw tightening at Jacob's detailed account of suspicious deaths dismissed as accidents without proper investigation, including relatives of local families the sheriff had grown up with. Decades of law enforcement experience warred with family loyalty across the sheriff's features as he methodically examined the documentation, his professional training demanding verification, while his aunt's decades of unwavering belief in Jacob's innocence demanded acknowledgement. The balance finally tipping when Victoria West's voice emerged clearly on a recent recording Ethan had accidentally captured on his phone during their confrontation at the farmhouse. Her explicit threats against a minor constituting actionable criminal behavior regardless of the historical claim's validity. With decisive authority that explained his continued electoral success, Sheriff Holloway radioed his department to issue specific instructions. Regular patrols passed both the Caldwell property and Martha's farm. A background check on Victoria West focusing on corporate activities in 3 counties, and most importantly, immediate dispatch of Deputy Rodriguez to maintain protective watch over the property, with explicit orders to admit no one without direct authorization from the sheriff himself. As Michael Holloway organized the evidence for secure transport to the county office, he explained to Ethan with cautious optimism that while corporate influence ran deep in the region, threatening a child constituted a line even powerful interests couldn't easily cross without consequences. His expression softening momentarily to reveal the boy who had grown up hearing stories of Jacob's disappearance from the aunt, who had never stopped loving the missing man, whose voice now provided the possibility of long-delayed justice. The comforting presence of Deputy Rodriguez had initially brought a sense of security to the farmhouse as he established watchful vigilance from the front porch. His professional demeanor and respectful interaction with Sheriff Holloway, suggesting competent protection, while Martha prepared a simple dinner to fortify them through what promised to be a tense evening of evidence documentation. The shattering of this fragile peace came with shocking swiftness as the deputy returned from a routine perimeter check, his service weapon suddenly drawn and leveled not at external threats but directly at Sheriff Holloway's unsuspecting back. His formerly respectful tone transforming to cold command as he ordered them to place all evidence on the table and step away, while using his free hand to activate a cell phone speed dial that summoned Victoria West with the simple phrase, "Package secured, collection required." The betrayal rendered Martha momentarily speechless, her weathered face reflecting disbelief that quickly hardened to contempt, as Rodriguez mechanically explained that 5 generations of poverty had made Alpine's financial offer impossible to refuse, his children's college funds and retirement security purchased with the simple act of ensuring evidence disappearance and witness compliance. From his hiding place within the kitchen pantry where the tunnel entrance remained concealed behind shelving, Ethan watched through a narrow crack as Sheriff Holloway was expertly disarmed and restrained alongside his aunt. The sheriff's controlled fury evident in his rigid posture, while he systematically catalogued his deputy's vulnerable positions and tactical mistakes, clearly planning resistance despite zip ties securing his wrists. Victoria West's arrival brought clinical efficiency to the betrayal, her expression revealing neither pleasure nor regret as she methodically examined each document and recording device, separating items for destruction while occasionally photographing selections with her smartphone. Her conversation with Rodriguez focusing on acceptable narratives involving an orphaned boy's tragic accident in the dangerous old house after the sheriff and his elderly aunt had departed. The tunnel entrance behind the pantry shelving offered Ethan's only advantage. His knowledge of the passage system that honeycombed beneath the properties representing geographical leverage unknown to Alpine's representatives, and with Ranger silently shadowing his movements, the boy navigated the subterranean darkness with newfound determination. No longer a frightened orphan but the inheritor of Caldwell responsibility that transcended mere property ownership. Emergency supplies Jacob had stored in the cave laboratory decades earlier provided unexpected resources, a powerful flashlight, coils of rope, and most critically, an ancient but functional flare gun with 3 weatherproof charges that had maintained their integrity within specialized containers. The underground passage map Ethan had discovered revealed a critical access point beneath Martha's kitchen root cellar, allowing approach from an unexpected angle, while Victoria continued methodically organizing evidence for destruction. her corporate efficiency leaving no room for the human element represented by a 12-year-old boy and his loyal German shepherd, navigating darkness with the determination of those who have nothing left to lose and everything to company. Protect. As Victoria's precisely manicured fingers reached for Jacob's recorded confession with obvious destructive intent, Ethan positioned himself at the secret access point. Remembering Jacob's voice describing how previous generations of Caldwells had survived against overwhelming odds through not just courage but strategic thinking, the boy's fingers tightening around the flare gun while Ranger's muscles tensed beside him. Both ready to emerge from darkness into a confrontation that would determine not just their fate, but the legacy Jacob had protected at the cost of his freedom, reputation, and ultimately his life. The ancient farmhouse floorboards had settled over decades into patterns Jacob Caldwell had meticulously mapped in his journal, knowledge that allowed Ethan to navigate the crawlspace silently until positioned directly beneath the kitchen, where Victoria continued her methodical evidence sorting, while Rodriguez maintained his weapon trained on the restrained sheriff. And Martha. Taking a deep breath that seemed to draw courage from the very foundations of the house, Ethan aimed the flare gun at the furthest corner of the room and fired through a gap in the floorboards, the ancient charge performing perfectly as it erupted in blinding crimson illumination and billowing smoke that instantly filled the kitchen with disorienting chaos. Rodriguez's instinctive reaction pulled his attention and weapon toward the unexpected threat, creating the critical moment Ethan had strategized as he simultaneously threw open the hidden access panel with a thunderous crash that served as Ranger's signal, the German shepherd launching through the opening with explosive force born of protective instinct and perfect timing. Nearly 80 pounds of focused canine muscle collided with Rodriguez's arm, powerful jaws clamping around the deputy's wrist with precision that targeted his weapon hand without lethal force. The man's scream of pain and surprise, accompanied by the clatter of his service pistol, skittering across the linoleum as Ranger executed the protection training Ethan had practiced during their years together on the streets. Sheriff Holloway exploited the chaotic moment with professional efficiency, his zip-tied hands proving insufficient restraint as he drove his shoulder into the distracted deputy's midsection. Decades of wrestling experience evident in the controlled takedown that pinned Rodriguez beneath superior weight and leverage, despite the sheriff's bound condition. Victoria's corporate training apparently included crisis response, as she abandoned any pretense of composure, snatching Jacob's recorded testimony and several key documents before bolting toward the door while smoke continued billowing through the kitchen. Her parting threat that nothing will matter once I reach the office incinerator, hanging in the air as she disappeared into the night toward her waiting vehicle. Martha had already begun sawing through her nephew's restraints with a steak knife retrieved from the drawer behind her, her movements displaying surprising dexterity for her age as Ethan emerged fully from the hidden passage, the boy rushing to secure Rodriguez with his own handcuffs while Ranger maintained vigilant pressure, the German shepherd's disciplined restraint proving as impressive as his initial attack. The sheriff's professional calm reasserted itself immediately upon being freed, securing his former deputy while simultaneously radioing for backup and issuing an all-points bulletin for Victoria West, though his grim expression confirmed what Ethan already understood, that the 15-minute drive to Alpine's regional headquarters would likely provide sufficient time for critical evidence destruction before any official intervention could prevent it. As distant sirens announced approaching reinforcement, Sheriff Holloway knelt before Ethan with unexpected deference, his voice quiet but intense as he acknowledged that without the boy's courage and his dog's perfectly executed intervention, the evidence would already be destroyed and their lives potentially forfeit. His expression shifting to one of strategic determination, as he asked whether Jacob might have created contingency measures against precisely this scenario. Having clearly known the corporate lengths Alpine would pursue to protect their interests, his question igniting sudden realization in Martha's eyes as she whispered with trembling voice, "The will, Michael. Remember I told you about Jacob's will." With Rodriguez secured and backup en route, Martha's weathered hands trembled as she moved toward the antique roll-top desk in her living room, her fingers working a hidden mechanism that released a secret compartment invisible to casual inspection, withdrawing a sealed envelope yellowed with age but preserved with reverent care. "The night before he disappeared," Martha explained, voice thick with emotion as she carefully broke the wax seal bearing the Caldwell family crest. "Jacob brought this to me, made me swear I would protect it until either he returned or someone with rightful claim appeared, someone who would understand what he'd discovered was meant for more than profit." The document inside bore the unmistakable authenticity of legal watermarks and notarized signatures, a last will and testament executed with careful foresight that named My Blood descendants, verified through scientific confirmation, as the rightful heirs to not merely the property but specifically the mineral rights beneath Holloway Ridge, with detailed codicils establishing conservation easements that permitted development only under strict environmental protections, and with mandatory allocation of proceeds toward renewable energy research and community development. Sheriff Holloway scanned the document with professional assessment, noting the impeccable legal construction and the 3 witness signatures from respected community members, including a state judge who had subsequently served on the federal bench, creating a virtually unassailable legal foundation that even Alpine's expensive lawyers would struggle to circumvent in open court. It was the DNA testing documentation included within Jacob's hidden container that completed the puzzle. The scientific analysis performed decades before such testing became commonplace, having compared core genetic markers between samples from Jacob, his suspected descendants in several family lines, and space left for future confirmation, with a handwritten note explaining Jacob had discreetly facilitated a child with his college sweetheart before meeting Martha, the woman having married another man who raised the child as his own to avoid 1,952nd social stigma of unwed motherhood. Ethan's hands shook as he examined a family tree Jacob had meticulously constructed and updated throughout the years, showing his secret monitoring of descendants across generations until the final branch ended with a familiar name, Ethan's mother, who had died beneath the highway overpass 2 years earlier, her addiction having obscured family stories that might have connected her son to his remarkable heritage before her tragic overdose left him homeless with only Ranger as family. Martha's gentle hands covered Ethan's as tears streamed freely down her lined face, whispering, "I knew the moment I saw you standing in that doorway. You have his eyes." His determination. Jacob always believed blood would call to blood across time. Sheriff Holloway's radio crackled with confirmation that deputies had established a perimeter around Alpine headquarters, preventing Victoria's escape, though they had arrived too late to stop evidence destruction, his grim expression brightening considerably as he examined the will's legally binding language and the DNA confirmation that established Ethan's direct lineage to Jacob Caldwell. Observing that Alpine's decades of legal maneuvering had just collapsed beneath the weight of legitimate inheritance, protected by not only county records but federal environmental statutes referenced within Jacob's remarkably reported, forward-thinking legal provisions. The imposing glass and steel Alpine Resources headquarters gleamed in early morning sunlight as Sheriff Holloway's official vehicle pulled into the executive parking area, Martha and Ethan accompanying him with the secure evidence case containing Jacob's will, DNA documentation, and most crucially, the security camera footage from Martha's farm that had captured Rodriguez's betrayal and Victoria's explicit threats against a minor, irrefutable evidence that transformed corporate acquisition tactics into criminal conspiracy. The 20-story monument to extractive industry dominance cast long shadows across the carefully manicured landscape, its reflective windows seeming to repel scrutiny just as the corporation had deflected accountability for decades, while inside, employees moved with the purposeful efficiency of those who understood their position in a rigid corporate hierarchy that prized results above methods. The building's security personnel hesitated only briefly before the sheriff's badge and warrant, their expressions suggesting this unprecedented interruption of the emergency board meeting currently underway on the top floor represented a dramatic deviation from corporate routine. The elevator ride upward passing in tense silence as Ethan clutched Ranger's support harness, his fingers finding comfort in the German Shepherd's solid presence while his stomach knotted with the knowledge that this confrontation would determine not just his future but the legacy Jacob had sacrificed everything to protect. The executive floor's hushed atmosphere and refined furnishings offered stark contrast to the weathered farmhouse that had become the unlikely battleground in this generational conflict, the plush carpeting absorbing their footsteps as an assistant's protests died beneath Sheriff Holloway's unwavering official authority. Victoria's shocked expression when they entered the boardroom confirmed she had believed her hasty evidence destruction sufficient to eliminate any threat, her composed corporate mask slipping momentarily before she regained control, addressing the assembled board members with practiced authority, as she attempted to frame the interruption as desperate harassment from a disturbed child and enabling relatives attempting to extract settlement money through absurd accusations. Around the gleaming mahogany table, 12 board members in impeccable business attire, displayed reactions ranging from irritation at the disruption to genuine concern at the sheriff's official presence, their collective attention narrowing as Holloway methodically arranged his evidence with the deliberate movements of a man accustomed to presenting cases before skeptical juries. The boardroom's atmosphere shifted palpably when Sheriff Holloway calmly placed Jacob's original will before the corporate attorneys, whose professional assessment of the document's legal validity registered in their suddenly concerned expressions, while simultaneously activating the digital screen at the room's end to display the security footage showing Victoria's unambiguous criminal behavior, her own words threatening a child's safety playing with damning clarity for the increasingly disturbed board members. The high-definition footage captured every nuance of Victoria's calculated intimidation, her deliberate invasion of Ethan's personal space, her explicit mention of foster care as leverage, and most damning, her casual instruction to Rodriguez regarding acceptable narratives for explaining any unfortunate accidents that might befall a homeless orphan who stood between Alpine Resources and their decades-long objective. The elderly chairman, whose silver hair and impeccable suit projected authority earned through 40 years in resource development, removed his glasses with deliberate slowness as he addressed her with quiet intensity that suggested controlled fury beneath professional restraint. "Is that your voice ordering actions against a minor, Miss West? Are those your exact words threatening foster placement as leverage for property acquisition?" Victoria's attempted justification about continuing her father's legacy and securing resources vital to corporate interests died beneath the chairman's raised hand, his complexion flushing visibly as he processed the potential catastrophic implications for the corporation he had devoted his career to building. His subsequent questions to the corporate counsel regarding potential criminal and civil exposure, receiving grave responses that included phrases like conspiracy charges, criminal endangerment, and decades of potential securities fraud that visibly shook several board members whose nervous glances suggested dawning realization of personal liability extending beyond corporate protection. The tension in the room crystallized into palpable discomfort as Victoria's isolated position became increasingly evident, former allies creating subtle physical distance from her at the table, while legal representatives began urgent whispered consultations with senior executives whose expressions darkened with each new revelation. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice carried unexpected authority as he explained he had no interest in destroying Alpine Resources, that Jacob Caldwell's will specifically allowed for responsible development of the mineral deposits, provided environmental protections remained inviolable, and community benefit was prioritized over maximum profit, his maturity and reasonableness contrasting sharply with Victoria's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control of the situation. Despite his youth and the overwhelming corporate environment, Ethan articulated Jacob's vision with remarkable clarity, occasionally glancing at Martha for reassuring support while Ranger remained vigilant at his side, the boy's genuine desire for fair resolution rather than vengeance creating visible impact on board members accustomed to adversarial negotiations. The chairman's decision came with corporate efficiency as security personnel were summoned not to remove the visitors but to escort Victoria from the premises. Her security clearances immediately revoked while legal representatives began drafting settlement language that acknowledged Ethan's rightful inheritance, while establishing framework for future responsible development under strict oversight provisions exactly as Jacob had envisioned decades earlier. As Victoria was led away, her carefully maintained professional composure finally shattering into naked hatred, her final venomous glare at Ethan carried generations of thwarted entitlement, the weight of her father's obsession and her own ambition collapsing beneath evidence that could not be buried or explained away through corporate resources that had previously proven sufficient to obscure any inconvenient truth. The chairman extended his hand first to the sheriff and then, with particular respect, to Ethan himself, his weathered face reflecting genuine regret as he acknowledged the company's moral obligation to rectify decades of wrongs while expressing genuine corporate interest in the revolutionary mineral applications Jacob had discovered, suggesting partnership rather than exploitation might finally honor the visionary engineer's original intentions that had been buried beneath corporate greed and environmental disregard for nearly half a century. The explosive revelation of Alpine Resources' decades-long conspiracy erupted across media platforms with unprecedented velocity, transforming overnight from regional curiosity to national headline as major networks dispatched reporters to the previously overlooked mountain community. Satellite trucks crowding the narrow main street, while locals found themselves suddenly sought after for interviews about the corporation's historical strong-arm tactics. Ethan's extraordinary journey from homeless orphan to corporate whistleblower captured public imagination with particular intensity, his compelling presence during carefully managed interviews reflecting a maturity beyond his 12 years as he articulated not personal grievance but genuine concern for environmental stewardship and community well-being. Ranger's protective presence beside him adding visual impact that social media amplified into viral phenomenon. Investigative journalists descended upon county records with renewed scrutiny, uncovering patterns of environmental violations, mysterious property transfers following owner accidents, and systematic exploitation of rural communities that extended far beyond Holloway Ridge. Their findings validating Jacob Caldwell's decades-old warnings while revealing corporate malfeasance extending into neighboring states. The explosive cache of documents Jacob had preserved provided irrefutable evidence linking Alpine's historical leadership directly to contaminated watersheds, suppressed health studies, and political influence purchasing that had allowed operations to continue despite documented harm, with particularly damning correspondence between Victoria's father and regulatory officials who had subsequently gained lucrative board positions. Public outrage crystallized around images of children with unexplained illnesses in communities downstream from Alpine operations. Elderly residents displaced from generational homes through manipulative contracts, and the systematic dismantling of environmental protections through lobbying efforts that prioritized quarterly profits over human welfare. The state governor, initially hesitant to challenge a major employer and campaign contributor, found political calculation shifting beneath her feet as public sentiment solidified against corporate impunity. Her hastily called press conference announcing a comprehensive investigation into Alpine resources carrying unmistakable undertones of political self-preservation rather than moral awakening, though Martha quietly observed that justice finds its path regardless of who claims credit for clearing the way. Environmental protection agencies that had previously rubber-stamped Alpine's impact statements suddenly discovered regulatory backbone as federal oversight committees announced parallel investigations into potential criminal negligence, securities fraud, and environmental crimes carrying potential penalties sufficient to threaten the corporation's continued existence without fundamental transformation of both practices and leadership. Alpine's stock price plummeted as shareholders initiated class action lawsuits against executives who had knowingly concealed liabilities. Corporate whistleblowers emerged with additional damning testimony about document destruction and scientific falsification, and competitors distanced themselves through public recommitment to environmental standards that further isolated Alpine's historical practices as industry outliers rather than standard operations. Throughout the media storm, Ethan maintained remarkable equilibrium. His primary concern focused on implementing Jacob's vision rather than punitive measures, his inherited authority now reinforced by public support as he worked with ethical members of Alpine's board to establish transparent development protocols for the revolutionary mineral deposits that honored both environmental stewardship and community benefit. His unsought fame providing platform for advocacy that extended beyond personal vindication to fundamental reconsideration of extractive industry's relationship with both natural resources and human communities. The full genetic mapping completed by university researchers confirmed what Jacob's preliminary tests had suggested decades earlier, establishing Ethan as not merely a direct descendant but the sole surviving member of the Caldwell bloodline, previous generations having produced few children with several branches ending entirely through tragic accidents that Martha quietly suggested might bear closer scrutiny given Alpine's historical tactics. The mineral rights valuation presented by independent geological consultants left even Sheriff Holloway momentarily speechless, the estimated value exceeding $300 million based on current market applications alone, with potential technological developments potentially multiplying that figure several times over as the unique properties Jacob had documented proved capable of revolutionizing battery storage, quantum computing components, and telecommunications infrastructure in ways that aligned precisely with his visionary predictions from the 1,970 seconds. Seated in what had become his study in the gradually renovated farmhouse, Ethan absorbed these figures with remarkable composure for a boy who months earlier had possessed nothing beyond Ranger's companionship and a tattered backpack. His expression thoughtful rather than triumphant, as he studied the development proposals submitted by companies around the globe, suddenly eager to partner with the unlikely inheritor of resources that could reshape technological cash-in development for decades to come. Martha's quiet presence provided steady anchor as Ethan articulated his developing vision, explaining that immediate personal wealth had never motivated Jacob's protective measures, but rather concern for both environmental preservation and genuine community benefit, values the boy had absorbed through Jacob's journals alongside the technical details of mineral extraction and processing methods designed to minimize ecological impact. The legal framework Ethan eventually established, with guidance from environmental attorneys and ethical investment advisors, reflected sophisticated understanding of long-term stewardship, creating the Caldwell Land Trust that placed 90% of the property under permanent conservation easement, while allowing limited extraction using only Jacob's revolutionary low-impact methods, with ownership structured to ensure neither corporate acquisition nor future family disagreements could circumvent the founder's sustainable vision. Mining royalties flowed not into personal accounts but into community development foundations that prioritized educational opportunities, healthcare access, and economic diversification for the mountain communities historically exploited by extractive industries, with particular emphasis on renewable energy infrastructure and technical training programs that would outlast the mineral resources themselves. In quiet evening conversations with Martha on the farmhouse porch, Ethan occasionally expressed wonder at the circular journey that had brought a homeless orphan to implement the vision of a great-grandfather he had never known. Martha's weathered hand covering his as she observed that Jacob had somehow known his true legacy would transcend mere geological discovery to encompass the human values embedded in his careful preparations, his faith in future generations proven justified through the thoughtful decisions of a boy who understood that true wealth existed not in corporate ledgers, but in preserved mountainsides, restored watersheds, and communities empowered to determine their own sustainable futures without sacrificing natural resources to short-term extraction models that left behind only environmental devastation and economic abandonment. The autumn sunset painted the restored farmhouse in hues of amber and gold that seemed to ignite the freshly painted Victorian trim with ethereal fire. The once dilapidated structure now standing proudly against the mountain backdrop as living testimony to resilience across generations of Caldwell stewardship. From his position on the wide front porch with its meticulously reconstructed gingerbread detailing, Ethan absently scratched behind Ranger's ears as he surveyed the property that had transformed as dramatically as his own life in the year since their desperate flight through mountain forests with corporate pursuers at their heels. The German Shepherd now comfortably sprawled beside the handcrafted rocker Martha had commissioned from local artisans, using wood harvested sustainably from the property's own forest. Inside, the farmhouse hummed with purposeful activity as staff from the newly established Caldwell Foundation for Youth Empowerment and Environmental Justice prepared for tomorrow's ribbon-cutting ceremony that would officially open the Plan residential program for homeless children, the organization having already provided transitional housing for 17 young people who, like Ethan himself just a year earlier, had found themselves without family support or stable shelter, their potential nearly buried beneath immediate survival needs, until the Foundation's intervention had provided not merely housing, but educational opportunities, emotional support, and connection to the land itself as healing resource, rather than exploitable commodity. The once mysterious steel door in the study now stood permanently open, its formerly hidden laboratory transformed into a small but powerful museum, chronicling not just the Caldwell family history, but the broader narrative of corporate exploitation, environmental resilience, and the responsibility inherent in resource stewardship. Educational displays featuring both Jacob's revolutionary mineral research and documentation of Alpine's historical environmental violations, serving as cautionary context for visitors ranging from school groups to corporate executives seeking models for ethical resource development. Monthly Foundation board meetings conducted around the kitchen table, where Ethan had once huddled alone in the darkness, now included Martha, Sheriff Holloway, and community leaders committed to translating mineral wealth into sustainable community development, their discussions balancing immediate needs against long-term vision, with the same careful consideration Jacob had demonstrated when creating his elaborate protective measures decades earlier. As the final rays of sunlight illuminated distant ridgelines with fading brilliance, Ethan felt Ranger shift position to rest his head on his young master's knee, the German Shepherd's soulful eyes reflecting contentment that mirrored his own as realization crystallized with quiet certainty. The true treasure of his unlikely inheritance had never been the valuable minerals that had driven corporate conspiracy and environmental exploitation, but rather the profound sense of belonging and purpose that had transformed a homeless orphan into the steward of not merely land and resources, but of values that transcended geological wealth. The greatest legacy Jacob Caldwell had preserved beneath the mountain being not rare earth elements, but the understanding that true worth exists in connection to place, responsibility to community, and the courage to protect what matters beyond monetary valuation. A heritage Ethan now carried forward with each decision that honored not just his great-grandfather's vision, but the fundamental belief that some treasures are measured not in market value, but in lives transformed and natural, beauty preserved for generations yet unborn.